Hello and welcome to the Age-to-Age experiment. Let me begin with a question that doesn't sound strategic, but quietly governs more decisions than any business plan. How often do you act out of guilt without calling it guilt? How often do you say yes because saying no would feel selfish? How often do you overextend because resting would feel irresponsible? How often do you carry something that is not yours because putting it down would feel wrong? You would feel bad about it. And here's the question that usually makes leaders extremely uncomfortable. How much of what you call responsibility is actually guilt in disguise? Guilt doesn't announce itself. It doesn't interrupt meetings. It doesn't knock on your door. It settles in quietly. And before you notice it, it has already influenced your tone, your decisions, your energy, and your leadership. This episode is not about blaming guilt. It's about understanding it, because what we don't understand, we obey. So stick with me, because today we're going to talk about guilt. All right, something fundamental. Guilt is not personal, it's relational. Let me develop it. Guilt is not born in isolation. It emerges in relationship. From an evolutionary perspective and psychological perspective, guilt evolved as a social emotion. It was a signal to the tribe. I may have broken a rule I need to repair, or I risk exclusion. In early human communities, exclusion was a death sentence. So guilt became a survival mechanism. That wiring never left us. Which means today, guilt is activated not only when we cause harm, but when we disappoint, we disagree, slow down, rest, set boundaries, or prioritize ourselves. How crazy is that? Your nervous system does not differentiate between the tribe might abandon me and someone at work might be unhappy with me. So guilt lingers, and when guilt lingers, it shapes behaviors. When guilt turns inward, it becomes identity. Individually, guilt often begins as a signal, but slowly becomes a story. At first, it sounds like responsibility. I should do more. I shouldn't complain. I owe them. But over time, guilt stops being something you feel and becomes something you are. Psychologically, this is where things get real dangerous. Freud spoke of guilt as the voice of the superego, an internalized authority that constantly judges the self. In modern psychology adds that unresolved guilt often leads to self-punishment. People do not punish themselves with whims. They punish themselves with overwork, with silence, with chronic availability, with never being enough for themselves. They give more, not because it's aligned, but because stopping would just feel wrong. And here's the cruel part. Guilt never resolves itself through effort. It only grows tired and asks for more. So how does it look like in teams? Let's widen the lens. In teams, guilt becomes a social currency. People stay late not because they need to, but because leaving early feels disloyal. They take on extra work because someone else looks overwhelmed. They don't challenge decisions because they don't want to be that person. Slowly, guilt becomes the cost of belonging, and often, no one explicitly enforces it. It lives in looks, in tone, in unspoken expectations, in assumptions, in who gets praised and who gets ignored. Teams don't burn out because they lack resilience. They burn out because guilt replaces choice. When people stop choosing commitment and start paying emotional debt, something real essential breaks. And now let's bring it over to leadership. For leaders, guilt takes on a heavier and more complex form. Leaders carry guilt for outcomes, for people's emotions, for decisions that create winners and losers, for not being enough, present enough, available enough, protective enough. And here's the subtle trap. When guilt drives leadership, clarity dissolves, it completely disappears. Leaders delay decisions because they don't want to hurt anyone. They soften expectations because they don't want to disappoint. They overcompensate with effort instead of direction. It looks caring. It even looks nice. It feels responsible, but it just creates confusion. Because teams don't need leaders who feel bad. They need leaders who are clear, grounded, and emotionally regulated. Guilt-based leadership doesn't reduce pain. It only spreads it. Now let me share a little bit of my story around this topic of today's episode. It's quite uncomfortable, I have to say. There was a moment not long ago when I realized that a significant part of my behavior was not driven by my values or clarity, but by guilt. I had made a decision that was necessary. It was rational, thought through, but emotionally, I felt like I had let someone down. And instead of sitting with that discomfort, I did what many leaders do. I compensated. I over-explained. I overworked. I carried more than was healthy. I tried to make it right, not through alignment, but through exhaustion, through self-sacrifice. From the outside, it looked like commitment. From the inside, it felt extremely heavy. At some point, I caught myself and asked a simple, brutal question. Am I leading right now? Or am I trying to feel less guilty? That question stopped me completely. Because guilt had quietly hijacked my clarity. That moment reminded me that even with awareness, with study, with experience, guilt can still take the wheel if we don't name it. And if we don't name it, we don't lead, we just react. Now let's bring it to a scaled mode, thinking about a whole organization. Imagine this dynamic scaled. In organizations, guilt becomes embedded in the culture. People feel guilty for taking vacations, for disconnecting, for saying no, for being offline, for not being passionate enough, for not suffering visibly. No one enforces it directly. It's reinforced internally. This is how organizations create cultures of quiet exhaustion. They may perform, they may grow, but they feel heavy. Because guilt is a terrible fuel for life. It can move things, but it drains everything in the process. Now, we have to make a very important distinction. Guilt versus responsibility. Let's draw a line here, okay? Responsibility says, I choose this because it aligns with who I am. On the other side, guilt says, I do this so I don't feel bad. Both have the same outcome, but how you feel internally is completely different. Responsibility creates agency, while guilt creates obligation. Leaders who act from responsibility can make hard decisions with compassion. Leaders who act from guilt hesitate, overgive, and eventually resent. And resentment is where leadership starts to rot, and it looks bad. All right, now our H2H experiment of the week. This one I call turning guilt into information. This week, slow down, just enough to notice guilt when it appears. When you feel pressure to act, pause and ask, is this a choice or payment? When guilt arises, don't push it away, sit with it. Don't ignore it. Don't pretend it's not there. Don't try to push it down to your unconscious. Ask yourself, what boundary did I cross? What expectation did I internalize? What am I trying to repair? When guilt is listened to, it becomes information, and precious information. When guilt is obeyed blindly, it becomes a prison. This is where emotional maturity begins. All right, now let's wrap up this episode. Guilt is not your enemy, okay? We're not blaming guilt here. It's part of our evolutionary process. But it's a terrible leader. Unexamined, guilt shrinks people, teams, and organizations. Processed guilt matures them. Leadership's not about carrying everyone's emotional weight. It's about transforming emotion into clarity, responsibility, and direction. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to continue exploring the H2H experiment in other platforms through our articles, our reflections, our books, all available at the h2hexperiment.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with the discomfort, and thank you for choosing awareness over autopilot, because guilt may shape behavior, but consciousness shapes the future. See you next time. Bye.